human rights and the developing agenda of CORE, which of course is an alliance of organisations including Action Aid, Amnesty, CAPOD, Christian Aid to the Earth, Save the Children, Trade Council, WWF, has established an agenda to advance the case for responding to, I suppose some people might call it the Rana Plaza agenda. I'm sure we'll be referring to cases such as that during the evening, making sure what we're seeking to do, and I strongly support the direction of this particular campaign, which is to advance the case of the best possible ethical standards for business and human rights, particularly amongst British companies working overseas or having an interest overseas. Just to explain part of why I've I suppose been drawn into this particular role, my involvement with most of those charities and campaign organisations as chair for the past 7 years of the something called the Grocery Market Action Group, which successfully campaigned for, some of you may know, the Grocery Code Adjudicator Act and the Grocery Code Adjudicator, which has now been in place for over a year, which is following on from a competition commission inquiry into the activities of supermarkets within the UK, but also looking at suppliers from developing and other countries into the UK, and to apply the grocery code to ensure fair dealing in the grocery supply chain. Applying the same principles to ensure that when consumers walk into a retailer in this country and reassuring them that their purchases are not condoning activities which result in the kind of Rana Plaza tragedy, is one which I think it is absolutely right that those of us who are watchful of those standards want to advance. So, in respect of the agenda for this evening, the kind of questions which CORE wish to raise, and I'm keen to ensure are articulated, are how British business operates overseas, how that impacts on workers in developing countries, and what role the British government could, should, might play in addressing the concerns with regard to those British operations. Obviously, part of the background is the UN Guiding Principles established in 2011, the OECD guidelines on multinational companies or enterprises. So we have 3 expert speakers here this evening, and I will invite them all to speak to you in order for about no more than 10 minutes each, and we'll have an opportunity for questions at that stage. Our first speaker this evening is Alistair Dutton, who is the director of SCIAF, and I do suffer from acronym blindness, so I have to be reminded of the Scottish Catholic
International Aid Fund.
Thank you very much. And Alistair's been operating in this arena for many years with Caritas and related organisations, CAPOD. And I'd like you to open our discussion on this subject, please.
Great, thank you very much, Andrew. Good evening, everyone. Firstly, let me thank Jenny for inviting us to talk to you all this evening. As Andrew said, I'm Alistair Dutton, I'm the director of SCIAF, which is Caritas Scotland. Those of you south of the border will be more familiar with CAPOD, who are Caritas England and Wales, and those from Ireland, if there are any of the Northern Irish amongst us, Troca is Caritas Ireland, and so we work together very closely on a range of issues, from programmes through to the policy and advocacy work that we do. And one of the things we've been working on is the whole area of business and human rights. Firstly then, what do we mean by business? Because obviously the term covers a very wide spectrum, from a one-woman street vendor selling food to multinationals like Nestle, BP or Walmart. And each affect development and people living in poverty very differently. But we know that some businesses, and clearly some businesses, have much more power than others. Some are large multinational companies which exercise enormous economic and political influence, and in some cases, a handful of these can dominate entire industrial sectors. From the outset, I'd like to say that we as SCIAF, we as Caritas, and NGOs generally, I'd suggest, are not anti-business, contrary to what some might suggest. We're pro-business, but we are pro-human rights and we're pro-human dignity, and very much in favour of the common good. And so really the conversation this evening, I hope, will be around how we bring those together so we find a more successful model for business, rather than being one against the other. I don't think that works for any of us. From our work on the ground, we know that business generates economic growth and jobs. It plays an important role in reducing poverty. It produces and provides goods and services that people need, and by paying taxes and the taxes of their employees, business makes a vital contribution to national budgets. From our programme work in South Sudan, SCIAF helps people with disabilities start their own shops, and in the Great Lakes region, in Rwanda, Burundi and the Congo, we're helping survivors of sexual violence establish small businesses. This support takes the form of loans, training, saving schemes, helping people store their goods, particularly fresh produce, transport it and gain access to markets. And in this way, these local sustainable businesses have empowered individuals and communities and helped them to work their way out of poverty. That's clearly one end of the spectrum. On a much larger scale, corporations also provide jobs, produce needed and valued goods, create spin-off industries, and contribute greatly to the local economy, or they can do. However, we know that the activities of some companies have had a very different and much more detrimental impact on people's lives. All over the world, big businesses have been implicated, directly or indirectly, in human rights abuse, poor labour standards, tax dodging and environmental degradation. In our latest paper, Taking Care of Business, we've set out some of the concerns that we've discovered around big business activity, particularly in the mining sector, studying the experience of our partners in Colombia. In the northwest of Colombia, we've been working with Afro-Colombian communities who, after decades of civil war, are now suffering from a new threat to their land and livelihood, and that is the mining industry. Foreign mining companies are being awarded huge areas of Colombian land to exploit, often without any prior consultation with the communities who have lived on the land for generations and depend on it for their way of life. In Choco, a region in Colombia well known for its vast stores of natural resources, and it's right in the northwest corner on the Pacific coast, SCIAF has been helping communities along the Atrato River obtain the land title for their territory. In 2011, as we were putting the UK action plan in place here, after 12 years of struggle, the Colombian government finally granted communities the title they needed for the land of part of their territory. But this was only to discover that parts of that land had already been promised to mining companies keen to extract precious minerals. Community members there fear that large-scale mining will destroy their environment and their ability to hunt and grow food. One community member, a mother of 4, told us, "If the big mining companies come, it will be very difficult. If they come with big diggers, it will destroy our environment. That will mean bad things for us, and we don't want them." For Afro-Colombian and indigenous communities, the land also has a cultural and spiritual significance. It's much more than a mere commodity or means of production.
Sadly, communities like those in Choco are not alone in their struggle. So while we must acknowledge the positive impact of business and the private sector, we must also be realistic about the negative impacts that business can have when sufficient safeguards aren't put in place. As SCIAF is a Catholic charity, and together with the other Caritas members I mentioned, we're inspired by the social teaching of the Catholic Church, which we believe offers another useful perspective for thinking about business and development. In the papal encyclical Caritas in Veritate, which was written immediately after the economic crisis in 2008, Pope Benedict reminded us of some basic truths, that the core purpose of economic life is not for the good of itself, but for the good of human beings. Economy is not in the service of the economy just for itself, but for the people who work and live within it. In other words, the economy is there to serve the needs of people and not the other way round. Pope Francis more recently has emphasised this greatly in the past year, and almost every time he speaks, he seems to make some reference to this. In the document he released last year, Evangelii Gaudium, he wrote, "Growth in justice requires more than economic growth, while presupposing such growth. It requires decisions, programs, mechanisms and processes specifically geared to a better distribution of income, the creation of sources of employment, and an integral promotion of the poor, which goes beyond a simple welfare mentality." In terms of solutions, many voluntary measures already set out what states and businesses should do to ensure that companies operate responsibly, and yet abuses continue. We've already heard about the UN guiding principles and how that's been enshrined within the UK National Action Plan, and I welcome the work that Vince Cable and together with William Hague have done to bring that into place. But governments need to move beyond mere advice and guidance into greater monitoring and regulation. Recent tragedies illustrate the gap between voluntary measures and the reality on the ground. You already mentioned the Rana Plaza factory disaster, which killed over 1,000 garment workers, mostly women, and the discovery of slave labour in the production of seafood sold by British retailers. They're just two recent examples. The UN Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights were adopted in 2011 and recommend that companies adopt a human rights due diligence approach. Such an approach requires companies to identify risks, prevent and address negative impacts, and account for how it addresses any problems. Companies therefore should have a due diligence policy, which they must put into practice. This should also mean reporting on its effectiveness publicly. And as I mentioned, these were put into UK practice through the UK Action Plan. But what we'd say is that the UK Action Plan only looks at listed companies, not at all companies, and actually that creates a difference in competition as well as a difference in practice of human rights reporting. There aren't standard reporting arrangements in place, and as I said, it's voluntary. Lack of transparency and information is a major obstacle for monitoring the consequences of business activities. If citizens are to hold their governments and companies to account, information concerning businesses' effect on society, the environment and people must be reported publicly. Governments must ensure that companies listed and non-listed are more transparent and citizens can access relevant and accurate information about their activities. Progress is being made. From 2016, some larger listed companies will have to report social, environmental and human rights impacts and risks. However, as I mentioned, those not listed on the stock exchange aren't covered by the new requirement, despite their significant market presence. A typical UK top 100 private company has sales ranging between 700 million and 3 billion and employs between 500 and 20,000 staff, and yet they're not covered. Extending the reporting requirement to those companies would not only open them to scrutiny, create a level playing field for all firms. It would not only be good for those affected by their operations, but it's crucial for fair competition. The Modern Slavery Bill, which is currently making its way through UK Parliament, is a good opportunity to strengthen the due diligence processes and increase transparency within supply chains. In line with the UN guiding principles, we support calls for the bill to require UK companies to publicise their due diligence policies and processes to identify and address the risks and incidences of slavery throughout their supply chains. Companies should also report the effectiveness and outcomes of those policies. In Europe, the UK also has an opportunity to press for improved corporate behaviour. To address the trade in conflict minerals, the European Commission is currently proposing a voluntary due diligence scheme for a number of EU-based importers. While the aim of the proposal is laudable, we fear as it stands it's not strong enough. The UK should press for a mandatory scheme that will compel companies to responsibly source natural resources in line with existing international standards. The scope of companies covered by the proposed scheme should also be broadened from the limited number of primary importers to include companies that first place component parts or finished products on the EU market. So it needs to look at the whole supply chain. Without strong legislation, we risk companies financing conflicts in countries including Myanmar, Colombia and the DRC that are the very focus of our UK aid flows. And so what we do with one hand, we undo with the other. In Scotland, meanwhile, while legislation at an EU and UK level is obviously important, we here in Scotland can and should play our part too, not least by ensuring that where we have economic influence, we use it widely. In Scotland, we spend £9 billion a year procuring all types of goods and services from the public purse, and that's a lot of purchasing power. Guidance to accompany the recent Procurement Reform Act that we were involved with last year must ensure that the international standards like the UN Guiding Principles are reflected and enable public bodies to spend their money responsibly. The Scottish Government has supported the Scottish National Action Plan that complements the UK Action Plan on Human Rights, which contains an important acknowledgement of our international human rights obligations, including the guiding principles. As part of this, the Scottish Government could take a proactive role in raising awareness among Scottish businesses of their obligations. The mining industry in Colombia is a stark illustration of the potential human rights violations by businesses where safeguards are not in place. To conclude then, very briefly if I may, much of the thinking has already been done and most of what is needed already exists, but it's voluntary and it only applies to a few. We want standard reporting requirements so that we can make comparisons between businesses and so that all businesses are clear what's expected of them. It needs to be mandatory so that there's no unfair competition between different segments of it, but also everybody is clear that they have to do it. And it needs to apply to all, and it needs to apply to the whole supply chain. We need to end a culture of deniability. This isn't anti-business, it's built on a clear understanding of the common good and social responsibility. It looks to create a thriving, sustainable economy which promotes people's well-being and protects them from its excesses, which are contrary to the common good. It looks to create a strong, fair and just framework for all businesses to compete, that prevents human rights abuses and protects everyone, particularly the poorest and most marginal. We live in a world where the number of billionaires is increasing, while 1 in 8 people around the world remain hungry. Our current economic and business model is working for some, but it's not working for the world's poorest people. We think that by working together and by listening to people at the sharp end, we can end sharp practices and we can change it.
Thank you very much. I'll move straight on to Louise, Rouse, who's Director of Campaigns and Engagement and Share Action, a lawyer who's engaged with investors and listed companies dealing with environmental, social governance issues with those companies. So it's very happy to see what you're saying. And that tells us more about SCIAF.
Thanks very much. You're troopers to be here at this hour of night on a very long day, so I'll try and keep it entertaining. Business and Human Rights, a Liberal Cause is the title of the talk, and I was at a conference, you never get to see anything that's happening at a conference, so I was catching up on Tim Farron's speech where he was reclaiming Winston Churchill on the basis that if Winston was around now, he'd be reconverted into being a Liberal on the basis of the Human Rights Act and the difference of opinion between the governing parties with regard to human rights. So business and human rights is very much a Liberal cause and a Liberal Democrat cause, and reporting as it relates to companies and human rights is very much a Liberal Democrat cause. The manifesto of the Liberal Democrats last year, the last election cycle, included a commitment to reintroduce the operating financial review, which they carried with them into the agreement for government, and it's what led to the reforms of company reporting that are now on the UK statute books. So this is very much traditional Liberal Democrat territory. They have been the party that have led the way on this issue. And so I want to talk, following on from what Alistair said, the role of reporting within the protection of human rights when businesses are acting. I was a corporate lawyer. I'm not a recovering corporate lawyer. Some people style themselves. I was quite happy to be a corporate lawyer, and I was even worse, a banking lawyer. So I was possibly the worst type of lawyer there is. So I'm very much not anti-business at all, and I was in a panel earlier this afternoon where I was defending capitalism. So I'm definitely not coming from a red perspective, shall we say, with regards to business. However, the reality is that human rights have been made subservient to business interests, particularly in large parts of the world, where there isn't a government like the US government to keep a boot on the neck of the offending company. There isn't a free media to report on what's actually happening, so very often we don't know. And there is wide-scale corruption in that particular country, which often means that HQ back in England doesn't even quite know what's going on. It's not necessarily Machiavellian plots with cats in steel towers in London that's resulting for this. So the question really is, how do we elevate human rights so that they take their proper place above business interests? And how do we ensure that good businesses can manage the risks that they face from it? And reporting plays a crucial role in that, because reporting is what gets monitored, gets managed. If you have to report on something, we all have it in our own workplace. If you have to give a quarterly report to your boss, you keep an eye on that because you have to be able to tell what's going on. And it's the information flow to stakeholders. And the particular group of stakeholders that I work with most often are investors. My role is to bring to the attention of investors in large listed companies various environmental, social, human rights issues that might be going on, and explaining to them why they, as owners of companies, should take action on those particular issues. And so I read an extraordinary number of annual reports each year. They're related. And so I read a lot of these annual reports, and so I was very involved with Biz when they were, doing the narrative reporting, trying to make it useful in the back and forth as between whether prescription means boilerplate or the lack of prescription means boilerplate. And I think both. It's probably, I don't think either one removes boilerplate, to be honest. But reports are what's given to investors. Investors cover thousands of companies. So, there's this idea that big investment institutions know what's going on in every company. They don't. They're often taken by surprise. They were completely taken by surprise by Rana Plaza and then sprang into action, but they had no forewarning of that. They rely on the information the companies give them. And so another, I would say, traditional territory of this Liberal Democrat government has been looking to the investment community to take responsibility as owners of companies to take action. We've seen that in the executive remuneration reforms, which has said, look, you are the owners of companies, you need to take responsibility. That is a perfectly fine mandate. That is what I spend my time doing as well. But you have to make sure that those people are armed with the information they need to take action. And in that, there are still some deficiencies with regard to the reporting framework that we should seek to reform. I think the Liberal Democrat Party is the party that has legitimately taken leadership and ownership of this issue, is the party that can push it through, not least because it also has Secretary of State in Biz, a as one of its departments. So one of the key issues I want to take just as illustrative is the modern day slavery issue. So this is an umbrella term, modern day slavery. It covers a whole host of human rights abuses, from trafficking to labour exploitation. Exploded onto the front pages when we had the Guardian revelation about the Thai seafood industry. I had been at a conference 3 weeks previously organised by the Guardian, where Professor John Ruggie, the author of the UN Guiding Principles, stood up and said to a packed room, if you have Thai seafood, you have slavery in your supply chain. 3 weeks later, the story broke in the Guardian. It was news to everybody. It was tweeted on the day, but investors weren't at that conference or weren't particularly paying attention, and it hadn't been written anywhere that they were looking at. The modern day slavery bill that's going through the Houses of Parliament at the moment is a fantastic advance, and it's a really good thing to see the UK doing. But unless it includes a provision relating to the role business has to play in it, it will be inadequate. Because business has a huge role to play in terms of stamping out modern day slavery. So under discussion is what should we do? And there should be some sort of supply chain transparency, supply chain monitoring requirement by companies to report what they do, if they do anything. And it could be that they don't do anything, which alerts people that maybe I should ask them some questions. So it doesn't impose any sort of requirement that they should do something. The question, there will be differences of opinion as to how best to achieve that in legislative form, but I think the criteria we need to look at is that it's universally applicable. So by that I mean companies have no choice but to report on the topic. And in that there's a very dry and boring bit about narrative reporting, but companies' reports are now split in two. There's a director's report, which all companies must fill out, and then there's a strategic report, which the contents of which can be determined by the company depending on what they consider material to their business. It's very important that we don't package off modern day slavery into that latter half, i.e. report on it if you think it's material to your business. Because the whole point of the modern day slavery bill is this is such an important issue, business has a role to play in helping to tackle it. It's not a case of whether it's material to your business, it's a case of you should report on this because you have a role to play. And the analogous provision we have at the moment is greenhouse gas emissions. So in the current split on narrative reporting, you have to report on human rights and gender to the extent that it is material to your business, but you must report on greenhouse gas emissions because that is seen as an overarching requirement that all businesses have a role to play in. And I think modern day slavery should be looked on in that vein, particularly, otherwise you have to ask why are we putting through a whole modern day slavery bill if we don't see it as being that important. So it should be universally applicable. I think there is a big issue with what companies should reporting apply to. I mainly focus on listed companies because I focus on shareholders, but many private companies have investors. They have private equity investors. So Boots, before it was bought by Walgreens, was owned by a private equity vehicle. Many pension funds are private equity. The Church of England was famously invested in Wonga, which is not a listed company, but was held by private equity vehicles. IKEA is a private company. There are huge private companies in the world. So from a stakeholder perspective, they clearly have a role to play. From an investment perspective, they are not completely removed from the investment universe either, simply because they're not listed. I think practically you could look at, in an ideal world, I think we would apply it to all companies over a certain size, recognizing the heft that they have. But I think it's very important that we get it on the books, even if that's going to be a transitional stage, even if there's an acknowledgement that private might have to follow. So I think modern day slavery, also a key thing in reporting, this comes back to the box ticking, is I think you have to give companies some indication of what good looks like. If you say, please report on your supply chain, I'm going to have great fun reading next year, on what that means to people. And in fact, it'll mean the same 20 pages of blandness to every single company, to be honest, and that the lawyers have poured over and have been very comfortable about. If some guidance is given again, this is the sort of thing we would expect to see in a report. I think that's very helpful to companies. It's very helpful for investors, and it's very helpful for stakeholders to be able to measure. And it's not overly onerous. And even if it leads to boilerplate, it won't lead to any more boilerplate than we're currently getting under the current framework. So I think that modern day slavery is a great opportunity to really put to the test the value of reporting and what it can do. Tax has been the other topic. Tax has exploded. Tax was, boring. No one was interested in tax except how much you paid on a personal level. It's now, the campaign issue of a lifetime. UK has taken a